Mary Tamm, Second Generation, The Autobiography, Volume 2. Read by the Timekeys, Romana. Chapter 3. The Armageddon Factor. My time on Doctor Who was drawing to a close as the last story went into rehearsal. Despite rumours to the contrary, my mind was made up about not continuing in the series, and although Graham Williams, now back in the saddle as producer, took me out to lunch with my agent, Irene Dawkins, and tried to persuade me to stay on, I was not in any way tempted. I think Irene was quite keen on my continuing too, but told me the decision was ultimately mine. Graham just could not or would not take no for an answer, and although I did not know it at the time, he was in behind-the-scenes negotiations with Tamm, too, who was asking for more control on the program and had even threatened to leave the show. Graham asked me if I would stay on if Tamm was no longer involved, but my answer was still the same. He never gave up, though, and continued assuming I would change my mind until the very last studio day. Talk about persistent. When I was reading the scripts before rehearsal, I did notice that the character of Romana had more power in this story, not only in operating the TARDIS and being in charge of the tracer, but also establishing the time loop, which was an integral part of the tale. She also seemed to make startling, brainy comments and suggestions too, whilst challenging the Doctor more by answering back and generally seeming less in awe of him. I wondered whether Graham had directed the writers to utilize her intelligence more, in order to entice me to stay on. Maybe I was just being cynical. We convened at the Acton Hilton with a large cast of fine actors, including John Woodvine, William Squire, both highly respected Shakespearean actors, David Herries, Barry Jackson, and Valentine D. Wall, to name but a few. I was thrilled to make the acquaintance of Lalla Ward, who was playing Princess Astra, or Disastra, as she wittily referred to herself. She was a girl with a fine sense of humour, so fitted right in with Tom, John, and me, who always liked to laugh during the working process. Her nickname for me was Trattoria Romana. Ho! We were all delighted, too, to welcome back Douglas Adams as script editor this time. In the search for the final segment of The Key to Time, the Doctor and Romana land on the war-torn planet Atrios, which is in a state of perpetual conflict with its neighbor, Zeos. The writers, Bob Baker and Dave Martin, took inspiration from the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union to formulate the adventure in which the Black Guardian, the embodiment of evil and darkness, is closing in. The sinister shadow, who also desires the powers of the key, is encouraging the two warring planets in their enmity for his own ends. The script, though clever, was verbose and had not enough action scenes. This was a reflection of the fact that the money had run out on the show, so we were stuck with limited resources and had to make do with the BBC studios instead of going off to far-flung locations. If only. I even thought longingly of the coal mines in Wales at some points. Bob, Dave, and I created the original character of K9, so he came very much to the fore in all 6 episodes, even upstaging the actors at times, we felt. Poor John Leeson's knees were nearly worn out during the long rehearsal period, as he did his usual crawling around on all fours to hopefully simulate the tin dog. To make matters worse, Armageddon consisted of 6 episodes instead of the usual 4, and therefore, with no alleviation from the interminable studio days which took place in the airless, hot, and claustrophobic sets and apparently endless corridors, it was a real slog, and seemed to go on forever. Darkness seemed to prevail everywhere, and the subject matters of nuclear war and the eternal battle between the forces of good and evil began to get us all down. Even our director, Mike Hayes, my director on the Androids of Tara, who was usually so chatty and jolly, had no time to digress from the straight and narrow on this one. To his eternal credit, our designer, Richard McMahon Smith, worked wonders with the peanuts he was given to create the sets, and performed miracles with cardboard and buttons. Mike directed with his usual flair, and used the limitations of the studio sets very well, considering. When I watched the episodes back to do the DVD commentaries on this story, I was actually quite amazed at how well it worked, and to see the sets looking pretty good. The tedium felt by all concerned is in no way reflected in the finished product, and there was also more than a few touches of humor, which went a long way to lightening the darkness of the subject matter. I also was pleasantly surprised to see my costume for the last episodes on screen after so many years. A flowing knee-length dress in white, well, cream really, which harked back to the dress I wore in the first episodes and looked really rather gorgeous and even contemporary. I hated it at the time. So many fans have written to say how they loved my look in this story. My favorite makeup artist of the series, Anne Briggs, had given Romana a slightly more sultry look for Armageddon 2, and it suited her, I thought. As well as the relentless workload, more stress came from the off-screen dramas going on, regarding Tom and I talking with the powers on the 6th floor about the next season. These were kept from the rest of the cast and each other, although I did rely more and more on Lalla as a confidant, as we became firm friends. There were more dramas of a different nature to come. Lalla was a clever and witty person and a highly talented artist. She was forever sketching in the corners of the rehearsal room while Tom, John, and I were poring over the crossword, which she also proved to be surprisingly good at. We were delighted at her input and warmed to her even more. I noticed Tom eyeing her with mingled respect and admiration as the days wore on, and knew that Lalla had noticed too. We had a few girly chats about this. Lalla was always adamant that she did not want or need any romantic involvement at this stage in her life, as she had recently ended a relationship with a high-profile actor. I took her at her word and tried to keep Tom at bay, always sitting next to her at lunch or making sure I was between him and Lalla while we were crossword solving. He must have thought I was either a complete pain in the arse or fancied her myself. Matters came to a head one evening, however, when Tom, Lalla, my husband, Marcus, and I were invited to dinner at John Leeson's house. We had never visited before. Indeed, none of us really socialized much off-screen, so it was something of a first, which we were all looking forward to immensely. John and his lovely wife Judy lived in leafy Eiling, not too far from the Beeb, in a large Victorian terraced house, which they had done up from scratch themselves. They showed us round proudly, with all of us marvelling at John's hitherto hidden DIY talents. More revelations followed as John produced the most fabulous meal of venison, followed by homemade brown bread ice cream. It was the first time I had ever sampled these particular delicacies, and I was highly taken with them. We had no idea John was such a master chef. Not only that, but various sumptuous wines were served with every course, with John elucidating on their attributes and virtues the while. So he was a wine expert too, it transpired. What a guy. It was an evening of delicious bouquets and flavors which I still remember to this day. So delectable it was, and all the more impressive because we had no idea, hitherto, of John's culinary expertise or his mastery in the ways of the grape. Another surprise occurred after dinner. As we sat sipping a fine brandy in the sitting room, John turned on some classical music on a state-of-the-art hi-fi system, produced a conductor's baton, and proceeded to conduct the virtual orchestra with great skill. It was highly entertaining to watch, and we were open-mouthed with amazement at yet another of John's fine talents. He was a true Renaissance man, and no mistake, albeit one who hid his light under a bushel. We finally left about 1 o'clock in the morning, having been wined, dined, and entertained royally, and all piled into my little Minnie. Lalla was miming frantically that she did not want to sit next to Tom, and went in the front with Marcus, who was driving. I wedged myself into the back with Tom, knowing Lalla was secure in the front as the car only had 2 doors, and we occupants of the back seats were trapped, as it were. I was wrong, though. When we reached Chelsea, where Lalla lived, she nimbly hopped out of the car, said a hasty goodbye, and scampered off down the road. I was just about to ask Tom where we could drop him off when, to my amazement, he said good night too, and somehow managed to scramble over me to the open door and flee into the night. We watched in mingled horror and amusement as he legged it down the road after Lalla with a nimbleness which was quite remarkable for a man of his size. I sat myself in the front next to Marcus and voiced my doubts as to whether Lalla would be okay, and whether we should follow and make sure everything was all right. Marcus snorted with disdain, proclaiming they were both old enough to look after themselves. He had a point. We drove home, speculating on what the outcome of the evening's drama would be. Next day at rehearsal, Lalla was particularly coy about the events of the previous evening, and I decided not to push it. It was none of my business, after all. I was a little puzzled, though, as she had seemed so adamant about her aversion to Tom. Perhaps it had all been an act. Had she simply been playing hard to get? I could not make it out. John basked in our praises that day and was especially delighted to receive a wonderful hand-drawn card from Lalla proclaiming thank you for the delicious reindeer, with a picture of the aforesaid creature on the front. I think that expressed how we all felt. Very cleverly. Many months later, when I was driving past the British Museum in a line of slow-moving traffic, I heard an announcement on the radio informing me of the marriage that day between Tom Baker and Lalla Ward. I was so shocked, I drove straight into the car in front. Happily, the damage was negligible, but my incredulity was not. I could not help but reflect back on that particular night and wonder at my naivete. When I told Marcus that evening, he seemed not particularly surprised, saying, in typical enigmatic fashion, I told you they could look after themselves. And that was that. Of course, by then, Lalla was playing my role as the Time Lady Romana, and in any way, I was the instigator of that particular piece of casting. We had all, Tom, John, Lalla, and I, been sitting at a table in the BBC canteen over lunch when Graham Williams had invited himself over to join us. Without any preamble, he launched straight in. Now, Mary, let's stop beating around the bush. You are staying on for another year, aren't you? I can't believe you don't want to do another season, and so on and so on. I was nonplussed. My agent had already told him at lunch the week before that I was not staying on, and I thought everyone now knew. I did not know what to say. Graham went on. Besides, who on earth could we get to replace you? Unaware of his unconscious pun, Tom wittily suggested a talking parrot on his shoulder, pitching, or should that be perching, in as a new type of assistant. Not a bad idea, come to think of it. But Graham was not amused. How about Miriam Margolis? Asked Tom again. Graham's brow darkened even more. I glanced over at Lalla to see if she could help us out, and as I did so, a revelation struck me. Lalla! I exclaimed. What? Said Lalla. Lalla would be perfect as the next assistant. I insisted. We all eyed her cautiously and with gathering interest. No, said Graham. She's playing Astra. We couldn't use her in the next season, let alone... His voice trailed off as he paused for thought, obviously examining his own argument more closely. I mean, that is to say, at that moment Douglas Adams called him over to the next table, and he disappeared. We all discussed Lalla's possible new role with mounting excitement. Tom, needless to say, was the most enthusiastic of all, and I could see that Lalla was starting to seriously consider it too. Well, as everyone now knows, my flippant suggestion was finally adopted, and I got myself off the hook with Graham too, thereby killing two birds with one stone. Yippee! So when I heard the radio announcement of Tom and Lalla's union, it was, on reflection, not completely unexpected after all, and I always wonder whether I played some part in bringing them together. Meanwhile, back in the studio, we were still ploughing the interminable furrow of the Armageddon Factor. At the end of one long, tiring studio day, we had very little time to complete a particular scene in which poor old Canine is about to be pulverized and is moving along a conveyor belt to his doom. David Harries, playing Sharp, had a line which was, "There'll be nothing left but slag and clinker," which caused Lalla and me to shake with uncontrollable laughter every time. Of course, the more we rehearsed it, the worse the laughs became, and by the time we came to record it, we were helpless jellies of hilarity. Anne, my makeup artist, had to keep darting forward to mop the tears of mirth off my cheeks, and finally Mike Hayes, our director, stormed down from the gallery to tell us off. Okay, it was bad behavior, but it was nearly 10 at night. We were so very, very tired, and the line was ludicrous. I have 5 minutes to record this scene before they pull the plugs out. If you can't pull yourselves together, I'll have to cut you from the scene, Mike thundered. This only made things worse, as he was such a pussycat really that seeing him in this uncharacteristic rage somehow only added further kindling to the flames of our amusement. He rushed back up the stairs, and somehow we did manage to complete the scene without either of us corpsing, but only by the tremendous effort of biting our cheeks and digging our nails into our palms as hard as we could. I actually had blood in my mouth after afterwards. During the recording of the final episode, I was introduced to a time-honored tradition among the studio technicians, namely the famous and sometimes infamous BBC Christmas tape. Back in the 1950s, when much of the technical talent of BBC television was based at Alexandra Palace, a slap-up party was held for all staff members each year at Christmas. A part of the entertainment was a comedy film, made up of behind-the-scenes technicians and crew sending up the real performers, and real performers doing impromptu comedy sketches. The yearly tradition flourished, and by the end of the 1960s, clips of performers fluffing their lines and other cock-ups started to be included. At some stage, the medium changed from film to videotape, and the VT department took over production, with multiple copies of these tapes being circulated around the various BBC centres, instead of just being shown at parties. By the mid to late 1970s, the tapes had become extremely professional productions, with outtakes and clips from comedy programmes being included too. Ultimately, performances were specially recorded for the Christmas tape by artists in the regular shows, who became so used to having their slip-ups included in the tape that they merely quipped, "Merry Christmas" to VT, as soon as they realized they had made an error. So when Tom, John, and I were approached by a film crew with a camera and recording equipment, we improvised a sketch, especially for what would turn out to be the most famous BBC Christmas tape of all, 1978's notorious White Powder Christmas. Our characters were kneeling at the floor next to K9, discussing what we would like for Christmas. K9 sang a little seasonal ditty while I smirked bemusedly. At the end of the sketch, K9 asked the doctor what he would like for a present. Tom merely paused, grinned less viciously, and slowly turned his head to leer at me. We all collapsed in hysterics, as did the entire studio. How we find the time to do it in our hectic schedule, I shall never know. All those were the days. Now it would be very sternly forbidden, and the tradition died out many years ago, alas. Also, during the last episode, Tom and I were whisked away during a lunch break to record an interview for Nationwide, as November 23rd was to be the 15th anniversary of the transmission of Doctor Who's very first episode, the day following the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. After the last studio day was completed, my time as Romana was over. I went back to my dressing room to change, and then repaired to the bar to have a drink with my colleagues, and to say farewell to Tom, John, and Lalla. As I prepared to leave, I noticed Graham edging towards me with what looked like a contract in his hand. I flew to the lifts and pressed the ground floor button. As the doors were closing, I glimpsed him leaving the bar to follow me. I escaped just in time, and that was that. But you have to admire the man for trying, though. We remained good friends, however, despite my refusal to stay on, right up to his tragic and early demise in 1990. The Key to Time was hugely popular and achieved some of the highest ever audience ratings for Who. I was very proud of my contribution to it, and still look back on it fondly as the most popular body of work I have ever achieved, especially in view of the show's revamp for the 21st century. Doctor Who left our screens in 1989, but returned triumphantly in 2005. The program is listed in Guinness World Records as the longest-running science fiction television show in the world, and also is the most successful science fiction series of all time in terms of its overall broadcast ratings, DVD, and book sales. It has never left me, in a sense, as I still attend conventions all over the world to meet the loyal fans who kept the memory of the show going in all the years it was off-screen, with constant campaigns to bring it back. Long may it prosper.